Golden Oldies, written and told by Kiefer Adams. Toby the steam tram and Edward the blue engine rarely saw each other on the Fat Controller's railway, but when they did, they would catch up as best they could. Toby would often tell Edward about the Farquhar branch line and how Thomas was getting on, while in return, Edward would tell Toby all about how the main line was doing. The two engines were the most experienced that the Fat Controller owned, and many of the other engines would look up to them for inspiration and guidance. Engines such as Gordon and James are very careful nowadays of what they say about Toby and Edward. Otherwise, they might find themselves stuck on a hill or spoil their red paint. For example, of course. But not all the engines were as respectful to the likes of Toby and Edward. During the summer period, the Fat Controller had noticed that the work at Brendam Docks had become too much for some of the engines, so he decided to borrow an engine from the other railway. No one was pleased with who arrived, though. Devious Diesel was delighted to be back on the Fat Controller's railway, but at first he was as good as gold. He shunted the trucks where they were needed, checked with Cranky to see where everything needed to be, and was surprisingly polite for a short time to the other engines, but they knew it wouldn't last. I'm sorry to say, though, that Toby and Edward was soon targeted by Diesel. He called them old, slow and out of date, and bragged how the Diesels would be taking over. Most of the engines would have ignored this, as they had heard it all before. But Toby and Edward had never dealt with Diesel themselves before, so this was going to be a tough experience for the pair of them. One morning, Edward arrived at the vicarage orchard. He had brought supplies for the vicar's annual summer fete, and was talking to Trevor about the work. "I just feel tired recently," he said. "I want to make the Fat Controller proud, but I just feel like I'm wearing out." "You'll be all right," reassured Trevor, "as long as you rest well." "That won't do," scowled a voice. Diesel, with a train of tankers trailing behind him, pulled up alongside. "You are past it, old man," he growled. "We Diesels are taking over." "Oh, why don't you leave Edward alone?" roared Trevor. The traction engine rarely got angry, but Diesel had pushed him too far. "Edward is one of the most hard-working engines I've ever known," Trevor thundered. "I will not hear an oily buzzbox as yourself tell him otherwise. I wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for Edward. Now go away and leave us alone." Diesel was taken by surprise. He growled fiercely. "Very well, Trevor," he said. "Old iron," he added, giving a cold stare to Edward. And with that, he rumbled away. "Thank you, Trevor," said Edward, "but you didn't have to do that for me." "Of course I did," said Trevor. "I'm not going to sit here and let you be insulted." Edward sighed. But soon it was Toby's turn. "He called you what?" roared Thomas that afternoon. "An overgrown wooden shed with wheels that wasn't assembled properly," said Toby. "Just you wait till I see him," growled Thomas. "I'll show him what." "Don't let it get to you," Thomas said Toby. "I know what Diesel's like. Duck has told me all the stories." "Well, with any luck, he'll probably be sent away again," said Thomas, "and I would love to see that happen." "Thomas, don't think like that," said Toby. "As devious as he is, he's helping us until the Fat Controller feels satisfied with the work." "Puh!" snorted Thomas. "How long will that last? By the time the summer's over, we'll be spending the whole winter soothing hurt feelings." Thomas stormed away. Toby kept quiet, as much as he didn't want to admit it, but he knew deep down that Thomas would be right about Diesel. Meanwhile, Diesel had delivered his tankers and was making his way back to the docks. He was too busy thinking about what he would say to Toby and Edward when he next saw them that he didn't notice that there was a hot stretch up ahead where the sun had bent the rails. By the time his crew noticed, it was already too late. "Look out, Diesel!" they shouted. Diesel snapped out of his devious trance and noticed the stretch. With a clattering bump, he came off the rails and was heading straight for a nearby field. "Ew!" he cried. There came a splintering crash as Diesel felt bits of broken fence attach themselves to his buffer beam. With one final groan, Diesel ploughed into the field. His exhaust started billowing clouds of grey smoke, and he was coughing wildly. He gasped. "Who put this field here?" "Do you mind?" said a voice. Diesel looked over, and there was Terence. "I've told the likes of Bertie, and I'm telling you," he said firmly. "I'm the one who ploughs the fields." Diesel blushed a deep shade of red. Terence's owner went to the farmer's cottage to call for help. At first, when Diesel saw the breakdown train coming, he was pleased, until he saw that Toby and Edward were going to be operating the cranes. To make matters worse, the fat controller was on board Toby. He had a lot to say to the shunter. "You have said rude things to Toby and Edward," he boomed. "They are the most hard-working engines on my railway, and I will not have them be insulted by you. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," sneered Diesel. Toby and Edward, with the assistance of the cranes, were able to put Diesel back on the rails. He was sent away in disgrace on Henry's goods train to the other railway. At the harbour, the fat controller came to see Toby and Edward. "A fine job well done," he said. "You two deserve a reward." Toby and Edward looked at each other, but the fat controller continued. "Toby, I have my grandchildren down for the summer. If we ever need someone to take us exploring, will you and Henrietta do the honours?" "Yes, sir," said Toby. "You can count on us." "And Edward," said the fat controller, "it is my understanding that Mrs. Kindly's daughter is getting married next week. Can I trust you to take the guests to the church?" "It would be a delightful honour, sir," said Edward. The fat controller beamed. He turned and walked away. "Well, what do you think of that, Edward?" said Toby. "A couple of golden oldies such as ourselves managed to deal with Diesel." "Indeed," agreed Edward. "It just shows that there's still fire in the old-timers yet." Toby and Edward heartily laughed, pleased that they would never have to deal with the likes of Diesel again.